But let me just launch in. Let me just add a little bit, a couple pictures of books. I'll make two announcements on it. One, they're for sale and back. But really, as a writer, what I'm interested in is the intersection between people and place. How do we influence landscape, and how does landscape influence us? And the talk today is going to focus specifically on Seattle and a couple of the very large engineering projects that occurred at the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. My most recent book, this beautiful book right here, Home Waters, A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound, takes the deep dive into the Sound and tells the long-term story of the place, tracing it as far back as we go, at least from a human standpoint, which goes back to about 13,000 years ago, and then moves up through the present, looking at a variety of stories of how people adapted to the landscape, and then how certain plants and animals adapted. The goal being is, how do you understand this place? How do you understand the past to better understand the present and hopefully make informed decisions about the future? So all of those are in the back, but let me just launch in with geology. I have a degree in geology, and so all my talks always have geology no matter what, because geology is totally cool. But in order to understand the changes in Seattle over the last 100, 150 years, you really need to understand the geology. And in particular, you need to understand the glacial story of Seattle. So roughly about 18,000 years ago, a sheet of ice moved south from Canada, down between the Olympics and the Cascades, extended almost just a little bit past Olympia, and then retreated or melted back to the north. And at its greatest extent, when it was down by Olympia, that ice was 3,000 feet thick in what's now the Seattle area. So 5 Space Needles tall. So this was a massive, massive piece of ice. And as that ice moved through the landscape, it did several things that are really critical to understanding the story of Seattle. One is how that ice shaped the landscape. And two things happened. One is not necessarily the ice, but water flowing underneath the ice cut down into the sediment below and etched out these big, what I call the big troughs in the region here. These are what we refer to as Puget Sound, Lake Washington, and Lake Sammamish. Very deep excavations into the underlying topography. At the same time, the ice then also created a series of flukes on the landscape. What if we look at on a map, right here, this is color-coded for the landscape. See, obviously we're right here. But if you look at this, you'll see that there are a series of parallel north-south trending ridges and valleys. Basically, the glacier acts like a massive rake and scraped the landscape, so creating a very challenging topography. And if you spend much time in Seattle, you really experience this as you move across the city. As you go north-south in Seattle, it's relatively easy to move across the landscape because you're either on a ridge or in a valley. But if you ever go east-west, so for instance, I said I live just north of here. Whenever I go on a bike ride over to, say, the Burke Gilman over by Lake Washington, I go up a ridge, I drop down a valley, I go up a ridge, and I drop down another valley. So it's a very, very challenging landscape that we live in. And I'll come back a little bit later to the other part of the glacial story that's really critical to understand. But with that, we were then able, it's this glacial story that led to the shaping of the landscape, the reshaping as well, and it's the glacial deposits that I'll come back to in a minute. So this photo, which is on the front cover of my book, arguably the most famous photograph of landscape change in Seattle. This photo was taken in May, roughly, of 1910, and the photographer was downtown at about 4th and Blanchard, looking to the south into the city. So this is, if you're familiar with downtown, you know where 2nd and Stewart, roughly where the Moore Theater is, and what's now called the Josephinum. That's this building right here. So we're looking south down about 4th Avenue. And I will come back to this photo in much greater detail. But the question I was intrigued by is, how did we get to this point? Why are these mounds here? And what you need to realize is that these mounds are in essence pieces of a cake, if you will, that are left over. So imagine that the top of this one, and this one, these three mounds, at one point were all a single surface, basically a giant layer cake. And what we have left is the cake has been eaten away, and these are just three pieces that are left of that cake. They're eventually going to be removed, and I'll tell you that story in much greater detail. So how did we get to this point? Well, it begins with the story of Seattle. And that the city starts at about Pioneer Square. That's where most people think of the city beginning. And that's right at sea level. And over time, as the city grows, the business district slowly moves to the north. And as it moves to the north, it comes up in elevation. So think of walking from Pioneer Square up to the Pike Place Market. It's about a mile in distance. And in that mile, you come up in elevation about 100 feet. Because Pike Place Market's about 100 feet above sea level. Then, prior to the creation of this image, the Denny Regrade as it's called, the landscape rose another 100 feet in elevation in the next block and a half. So it went along fairly slow incline, and then this big step, and then you're on the top of the hill. And as it said, the hill was too high and too steep, so it had to be removed. And the goal with removing the hill was pretty simple. The hope was, and this is a quote from the day, is that business would flow unhampered in its natural channels. All you had to do was alter the landscape, and business would move north, and everything would be great. So that's the goal, is to somehow get rid of this hill. And the reason being, in part, is I think it gets back to one of the central stories of Seattle, is this desire to be a world-class city. And that people were going to do whatever was necessary to create an economic environment that was good for people. And that's what this is all about. So let's look at the hill. So here is Seattle Center up here. Here is downtown to the south. This is the original location of the hill, the outline of the hill. And like all hills in Seattle, it ran due north-south because of that rake effect, that big scraping of the landscape. It started low in the north end. It rose up to a high point here at 4th and Blanchard, and then another high point at 3rd and Stewart, and then dropped off, as I said, very steeply in this block and a half. Basically a very steep face there. And so what happened was this idea of a regrade. And a regrade is a term that is really unique to Seattle. No other city undertook anything on the order of Seattle in terms of changing the landscape. And in essence, a regrade means removing the hill and depositing the material someplace else. Basically taking a hill and converting it to a flat plain. And that's what they're trying to do here. And in Seattle, the regrades took place. There were 5 of them. The first one is in 1897. Removes about 100,000 cubic yards of material. The second one in 1903, about 600,000. The third one in 1907, about 600,000. The fourth, 1908 to 1910, this is when that photo was taken. The photographer's name was Asahel Curtis. 5.5 million cubic yards of material. And the final, 1928 to 1930 regrade, 4.5 million cubic yards. So about 11 to 11.5 million cubic yards of material was removed to lower the hill from its high point, which originally was about 200 feet above sea level, down to the new flat landscape about 100 feet above sea level. So it's about 100-foot shaving off the landscape. This to me is my favorite photo to really give you an idea of the scale. We're standing at 2nd and Pine. The photographer is looking to the north. And you can see a couple features here. One is running along the side of this slope right here. This is the second regrade. So literally, and I'll come back to this in a bit and explain how it's done, they would literally define where they were going to go, carve the landscape to that point, and then just leave the landscape until the next regrade. The other feature, you can see these white lines down here in the lower part of the image. These are actually logs holding up the hill, because as it goes from 2nd up to the entrance to this building, the Denny Hotel, that's a 100-foot elevation gain right here in that block and a half. It was just too steep for what they were building on, so they had to hold the hill up. And the final feature is this great building up here. This is the Denny Hotel. This was really the great structure on Denny Hill. Denny Hill had about 400 homes and apartments on it, so it was well populated. It was very much a middle class to upper middle class neighborhood. There were city council members, mayors, all sorts of business people were living on this landscape. But this was the great hill, the great building. Started in 1889. Work on it for about 4 years. They run out of money in the panic of 1893. It sits empty for about a decade. It's then purchased by a man named James Moore. He opens it about, very shortly afterwards, and his first guest is Teddy Roosevelt. The president comes and stays in this building. There is nothing left of this building because in that third regrade, that 1907 regrade, this building is destroyed because the building was in the way of progress. The hill was in the way of progress. If Seattle was going to be a great city, it didn't make a difference that its greatest hotel was in the way. The bigger picture was more important. So that building gets leveled. The question, of course, becomes is, how did they do it? How did they actually regrade the landscape? How did they lower it down? And again, this goes back to the glacial story of Seattle. As that ice sheet moves into Seattle, plows through, makes it down to Olympia, then retreats back to the north, it leaves behind 3 layers of sediment. So if you take any hill in Seattle and cut it open, what you would see is the lower 1/2 to 1/3 is a layer of clay. The next 1/2 to 1/3 is a layer of sand. And the top, the little ribbon or icing on top, is a layer of rubble. So basically all the hills in Seattle are big piles of dirt, in essence, then compressed by that ice. So we've all played with dirt. We all know the best way to get rid of dirt. It's a big hose. And that's what they're using here. This is called a hydraulic giant or hydraulic cannon. You start with water in a big pipe. You feed it through subsequently smaller pipes until it blasts out at the speed of a cannon. This was technology that had been developed during the California Gold Rush and used during the Klondike Gold Rush to wash away the hillsides. They do the same thing in Seattle. They just turn the hose on, wash away the hillside, collect all that water, collect all that sediment, feed it out through a series of pipes and conduits, and dump it out into Elliott Bay, unused for any purpose. Basically, all of Denny Hill ended up in Elliott Bay, where it still sits. So next time you're in downtown, go to where the Edgewater Hotel is. Go in, just dive off the pier there, swim down, and you will hit Denny Hill. It's just right there. I guarantee it's really fun. I encourage everyone. It'd be a good field trip, Alan, in the future. Every once in a while, though, they hit a hard layer in those layers of clay or sand, and they had a very simple solution. Take a stick of dynamite, ask the guy who's got dynamite to walk over, throw the stick of dynamite, blow up whatever in the way, turn your hose back on, start the process again, and that's how they got rid of Denny Hill. It's the primary way they got rid of Denny Hill. So I want to dive into this photo a little bit deeper, do, if you will, sort of the Ken Burns effect, and tell you the story of this hill. So this mound, and this mound back here, and this mound, these have come down through history and they're known as spike mounds. The idea being is that whoever owned this property didn't want the regrade to occur because the city didn't take any of the property. The way the process worked is the city would say, okay, we want to regrade a certain neighborhood. We want to regrade, say, between 3rd Avenue and 5th Avenue and between Pine Street and Denny, just as an example. What they would do is they would send out someone to every property and say, would you like your property lowered from the old elevation down to the new elevation? You'll keep your property, we're not going to take anything from you, but would you like it? If you agreed, you'd sign a petition. And that petition, once you got more than 50% of the people in the district who wanted it, that petition would go to the city council. They would pass legislation to pay for it. And the way you paid for it was what's known as a localized improvement district, or an LID. Then 3 people would go out to every property again, and now they'd evaluate how much was that homeowner going to benefit or suffer from having their property lowered from this elevation down to the new elevation. You would then pay an assessment to the city, And the city used that to regrade the hill. What's interesting is the city was only responsible for curb to curb. If you wanted your own property lowered, you then paid the contractor at the same time, and he then lowered your property down to the new elevation. Well, it turns out that the guy who owned this property, this mound here and this mound here, was up in the Klondike. He'd come to Seattle in the 1880s, he'd made some money in 1897 in the Klondike Gold Rush. He's back up there in 1908, 1909, 1910. He didn't get the paperwork. Comes back to Seattle in November of 1910, photos taken in May of 1910, so about 6 months prior. He signs the paperwork, and within about 2 months, by January of 1911, the mounds are gone. So it wasn't spite, and in fact, he was interviewed by the newspaper, and he said, I wouldn't do anything to spite the city. I wanted this to occur, I just happened to be out of town. So that's why it happens. So in this image, there are 3 houses, 1, 2, and 3. So house number 1 right here, we're gonna see it again in another photo, and it's gonna be on the other side of this mound. House number 2, we're gonna see start out on a mound and get lowered down to a new elevation. And house number 3 right here is never gonna move. It used to be up at the elevation of the top of the hill and was lowered down previously. And I'll explain the sort of details. So here's house number 3 down on the ground, and here's house number 2 up on its mound right here in October of 1909. November of 1909, here are the hydraulic giants blasting away, they're collecting water, they're starting to erode out from underneath this house. 1 month later, the house is on these pallets stacked up. And then we go from December, we make a jump to May of 1910. And here's the house again, it's down at this new elevation. What they did was, in order to lower the house from this elevation down, what they did was, underneath the house, you can see there's a couple of beams running across underneath the house. And under those beams are carjacks, those old carjacks where you turn a crank and the arm would rise up out of it. There's probably a couple hundred underneath there. We don't know exactly, but we know from another house that was raised up about 10 feet around the same time how that project worked. There are about 400 of these jacks underneath the house. And there were a team of workers, and each team was responsible for a number of jacks. And what would happen is, the head of the crew would blow the whistle, everyone would turn their crank a quarter bit, just a little bit, then they'd go to the next one, turn that one a little bit, turn that one a little bit, and through this process of sort of lifting and shifting and lifting and shifting, they raised that building up about 10 feet over about 24 hours. During the time, there were billiard tables in it. They played pool the whole time. What? Very smooth operation, very slick. The same thing happens here, they just do it in the opposite direction. They just sort of jack lower, jack lower, jack lower, and get it down to the new elevation. Curiously, with this house number 2, here's our house number 3. House number 2 never makes it all the way down to the ground. We can see it again. Here it is on these, it's stacked up pallets. They decided for some reason to build an entire new first floor underneath the house. I don't know why. Here is our house number 3. This is the one that had been on this side. It was slowly moved across the landscape. The way they moved houses across the landscape was a similar process. They'd put it on the beams. They'd lower the beams, this time onto little wooden carts, were then set on trolley tracks. They would pull the house across the landscape on the tracks. Once they got to the end of the track, they'd bring another set of tracks around and just sort of, leapfrog it to the next location. A very, very smooth process that they did. So here in 1912, the mounds are gone. Here's house number 3. Here's house number 2. It has the new first floor. Here's Lake Union in the background to place you. Here's Queen Anne. So we're about right there in this image, in the back. And then here in 1937, here's that original house, the house number 2, with the new floor underneath it, just sort of a nice close-up. 1950s, they decide to level the house and build a very handsome parking lot. So as of now, there's only one building left from the pre-regrade era in Seattle that I know of, and it's in very bad shape, sadly. So that's the first 4 regrades. The 5th regrade is done very differently, and I love this image because it really shows what the goal was, what the vision for this landscape was. If you could get rid of the hill before and after, then you would have this nice, perfectly flat landscape, this ideal space for business to flow unhampered into its natural channels. And that was really the dream behind it. So this is after they've removed that final hill. Just to place you in the landscape, this street right here, this is 5th Avenue. The Cinerama movie theater's around here, and if you think of the world in terms of donuts, there's a donut store right here. And I know some people, that's their reference point for the world. The 5th regrade is different. It's done in a different style than the first 4 regrades. Instead of using water, they decided to use basically steam shovels or excavators, as they're called. And they decided to scoop out the side of the hill because water is just too much of a problem. So what they did was they would scoop out all the sediment, they would dump it onto a conveyor belt. The conveyor belts then all were directed to a central conveyor belt that carried the sediment out to Elliott Bay. And that sediment then would be put onto a barge. And the barges were really a pretty nifty part of the story. Flat on the top, flat on the bottom, basically mirror images of each other. Between the top deck and the bottom deck, 2 chambers ran down the length of the barge. So the barge would be towed out into Elliott Bay. They would then open a stopper in one of those compartments. Water would then flow in. The barge would become lopsided, slowly tip over, dump all that sediment into Elliott Bay. The boat would flip over, right itself up again. That hole was now above the water line because it's no longer weighted down. Water would flow out, they'd screw it close again, they'd tow it back on shore, and do this over and over and over. That's how you get rid of 4.5 million cubic yards of sediment. Elliott Bay looked like chocolate milk for quite a few years, sadly. And if you've ever wondered, particularly after the most recent election, why anyone would want to be mayor of Seattle, this is the mayor. He got to be in charge of the last shovel of dirt. So perhaps that's why people become mayor. They get to do really fun jobs like this. And he's really happy because he knows that after 33 years of regrading, they have completed the job. They have removed the hill. Business could flow unhampered into its natural channels. There's just one problem. 1930, the middle of the Depression, and that promise is really never met. It's really not until the 1990s and the early 2000s and the dot-com boom, the biotech boom, Amazon moving in, that the Regrade district really becomes the business district that they had hoped. But still, and I'll come back to this again, I think it became part of the story of Seattle and a way to think about Seattle history. So I want to make a switch. And I want to make a big switch from Regrade to the Ship Canal. And the Ship Canal, I think, is a story that many people know, but I just want to tell you the story real quickly, and then I'll fill in many of the details. So the story is, how do you connect Lake Washington, which historically was at an elevation of about 29 feet above sea level, and historically flowed out the bottom end through Renton, what's called the Black River, to the Green, and then the Duwamish River into Elliott Bay. So how do you connect Lake Washington with Lake Union, historically at about 20 feet in elevation and separated by a little divide right here, Lake Union to Salmon Bay, which was historically a tidal inlet. At high tide, water would flow in. At low tide, water would flow out. It'd be almost completely empty. And so how do you connect those 3 bodies of water? That's the great question. The first person to propose it was this guy with the great beard down here, Thomas Mercer. Thomas Mercer had some property at the south end of a little lake right here. And on a 4th of July picnic in 1854, he proposes that we should call these 2 lakes Lake Union and Lake Washington. The idea being is that someday Lake Union will be the connection between the fresh water of Lake Washington and the salt water of Salmon Bay and ultimately out to Puget Sound. Now, if you know your history in Seattle, you know that the locks system officially opened on July 4th, 1917. 63 years after the idea is proposed. And if you've spent any time in Seattle, you know that's pretty good for a massive project, only 63 years to complete it. So we could give kudos to him. So Mercer's the first to propose the idea. Then we see another interesting development, and that is a proposal to connect Lake Washington to Lake Union for a canal to access coal on the east side of Lake Washington. If you're familiar with Newcastle, Coal Creek, Black Diamond, all those places on the east side, that's because in the 1850s they discovered coal over there, and they knew they wanted to get that coal out, but it was very challenging to get it from Lake Washington to Seattle. And one thought was, because Lake Washington's so much higher, all you had to do was cut a little passage between this portage, basically in Motley, and Lake Washington would then rush out and excavate out a canal, and we would then be able to move coal more quickly in the Seattle area. Obviously, that does not happen, but it's still a critical idea. But then a man named Harvey Pike arrives on the scene. Harvey Pike is the son of Thomas Pike, I think is his name, who was the person for whom Pike Street is named. And young Harvey was working on what was then the University of Washington campus in downtown Seattle, hence why we have University Street in downtown Seattle. And in payment for working on the campus, the board of directors of the University of Washington gives Mr. Pike the property between Lake Washington and Lake Union. And young Mr. Pike, Harvey has heard about this idea for a canal. So being an ambitious young man, he sets out to build the canal himself. He has a wheelbarrow, he has a pick and shovel, that's about it. You can imagine how far he didn't get in the project. But what he did do was he laid out a plat for what he called Union City and reserved the central part of Union City to be a canal system. And what he did, to his credit, is he starts to sell the property there. And the first person to buy property from him, one of the few to buy property from him, was his mother. So, yay moms for doing such good things. This, of course, doesn't go anywhere, but this is really the first person to try. Then, in the 1880s, we have the development of the first canal that actually links Lake Washington to Lake Union. The driver behind it was a man named David Denny. Arthur Denny and David Denny were brothers, the Denny party. David Denny owned a mill, a sawmill on the south end of Lake Washington. And by the 1870s, almost all the logs around that, all the trees had been cut. And he realized if he could access Lake Washington's trees, he would have this great source of wood. So they hire a crew to cut a canal through. And so where we are in this is we're standing at about where 520 is right now. We're looking to the east, and there's a low area right here. This is the Foster Island. And it's hard to tell, but in the background there's sort of a faint smudge of a landscape back there. That is Laurelhurst. So we're basically just looking east down 520. And so this canal is completed in 1885. At the same time, the crew completes a canal from Salmon Bay to Lake Union. So by 1885, the end of 1885, we actually have a functioning canal system linking saltwater of Puget Sound through Lake Union to the fresh water of Lake Washington. But again, if you've spent any time in Seattle, what do we like to do? We like to talk. We like to talk about things. We like to read, debate them, decide whether is this really the best idea or not. So here's our North Canal. This is the canal we know and love. And yet, because of various issues, there's a debate as to whether maybe that's not the best route. Maybe it would be better to build a route through Smith Cove, which we call the Inner Bay area. Or maybe we cut one through Thomas Mercer's farm, just directly through to Elliott Bay. That might work. Or maybe we cut one along the tramway. This was a railroad that was used, the Seattle's first railroad. Maybe those routes would be better. Or maybe it'd be better to go up the Duwamish River and go up the river route and then connect to the Black River. We wouldn't have to cut anything. So all these get debated. We have a canal. And yet we then spend another several decades debating it. And in fact, there was another idea, and this was probably the most radical, and that was to cut a canal through Beacon Hill from the saltwater directly to the freshwater. It's the shortest route, but it's really a dumb idea, to say the least, because that canal would have to be almost 300 feet deep and a quarter-mile wide. Despite it being a bad idea, they start work on it. Again, if you've been in Seattle for a long time, you know that that's something we like to do. This is the work they start doing. Again, they use the hydraulic giant. They take advantage of the fact that the hill is very soft. So where we are is we're on Beacon Hill, and we are looking out into the area what was then the Duwamish Tide Flats. It's now where the stadiums are. So roughly the two, the football, baseball, soccer stadiums are right here. This is West Seattle over here. So they work on this for about a year, washing away the hillside. And those in the north, in particular people like David Denny and Thomas Burke of the Burke Museum, they didn't want this South Canal. So they convinced the city council to turn off the water supply that was being used for the hydraulic giant. With no water, the project dies. And of course, we do not have a South Canal. But my guess is all of you have driven this route. If you've driven Spokane Street Viaduct or taken South Columbian Way up to Beacon Hill, the reason that road is at that exact location on Beacon Hill is this is where the South Canal is supposed to be. This green belt, this little cleft in the hillside, was part of that South Canal project. That's all that was completed. So they did work on it. They just didn't get, obviously, very far. And this is all about 1904, 1905. Then in 1909, Hiram M Chittenden arrives on the scene. The locks now, of course, are known as the Hiram M Chittenden locks. He was hired to be head of the Army Corps of Engineers in Seattle. And what Chittenden did was three things. One is he came up with the design for the canal. That is, for the lock system. You've all been there, I'm guessing, where there's the small lock and the big lock at that exact location. Chittenden is the person who located it and came up with the design. He also unified everyone in the city behind the idea of a North Canal. And third, and perhaps most importantly, he got the money for it. He got the federal funding to pay for building the locks. So in 1911, they started building the locks. And the way they did it is they built what's called a Coffer Dam. Basically a temporary dam around the dam site, or the lock site. And they start pouring concrete in it. Remember, this is still a tidal inlet, so water is on this side is flowing in, flowing out into the bay. But they start work on it. It takes about 5 years to build the lock system. And in February of 1916, and probably the biggest snowstorm Seattle's ever had, 21 inches of snow, they open the locks up, so they're complete at this point. And they allow water just to move in and out. The doors remain open because they haven't yet built the overflow dam. If you go to the locks, there's the locks, and then there's the overflow part where the fish ladder is. So they built another temporary dam, work on that for about 4 or 5 months. And in early August of 1916, they officially closed the doors of the locks. And they allow Salmon Bay, which had been a saltwater tidal inlet, to become a freshwater reservoir as it looks today. So that gets completed. So now let's jump to the Montlake Cut. We haven't talked anything about Montlake. So we're all familiar with this. Here's the stadium. The next image I'm going to show you is taken is a structure at this site right here at the very west end of the ship canal. So what happens is they build another Coffer Dam in order to excavate out the Montlake Cut, to make that connection from Lake Washington to Lake Union, or to Union Bay. And on December 31st of 1913, they blow up the Coffer Dam. They're in the process of taking it apart. And they allow water to flow from Union Bay Portage Bay into that Montlake Cut. It takes about 45 minutes. It's not much. It's a fairly small body. And everything is great. There's just one small problem. The north side of the cut is slumping into the water. This had been going on throughout the entire process of building it, but they thought, oh, if we put all that water in there, it'll sort of act as a weight and stabilize things. It doesn't work. So in 1914, they built another coffer dam. They pumped all the water out of the Mountain Lake Cut. In November of 1914, after putting a big revetment or sort of stabilizing the north wall, they blew up that second coffer dam. Water flows in, everything's great. There's just one problem. The south side of the cut is slumping in. So at this point they go, well, you know, maybe we should just take a break. So they take a break, and in 1916, so about a year or so later, they build a third coffer dam. And on August 26th, so in August, beginning of August, they've completed the locks, they flood Salmon Bay, and at the end of August, they now decide we're going to blow up the third coffer dam. They fixed everything in the cut, everything's great. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever worked in, say, safety issues. This dam, this structure is designed to fail. That's the goal of it. You want all this water to erode it out very quickly and fill it in. Amazingly, no one died. I don't know how no one was injured or died on this, but this is just to me one of the great photos really exemplifying how the world has changed and what you could and could not do. So it's successful, everything's great. So they then go around to the east end of the Motley Cut, and there's this gate system here. And they raise up the gate slowly, and over about 2 months, they allow Lake Washington to flow out and into the Motley Cut, Lake Union, the Fremont Cut, and Salmon Bay. And by November or so of 1916, Lake Washington lowers from its original elevation of about 29 feet above sea level down to its new elevation, 20 feet above sea level, equal to the Motley Cut, equal to Lake Union, equal to the Fremont Cut, equal to Salmon Bay. So by November, roughly, of 1916, you have a functioning canal system. July 4th, 1917 is the grand opening of this structure. So that's basically the story of this area. I want to just divert a little bit away and look at Green Lake. So we are roughly at the yellow star up here. This is, you can see Green Lake change over time. So Green Lake historically was a quite a bit larger lake. And although the lake is not real, the story of the lake is not really tied to the ship canal, it is sort of fits, to me it fits in with the story of Seattle. What happens is in 1903, the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm comes out to Seattle from Brookline, Massachusetts, from Boston, and proposes the very elaborate park system that we have to this day. And the main architect, John Charles Olmsted proposes that they lower Green Lake by about 6 feet. Okay, you can really see it in this image right here, the 1901 image. This red line going around the lake is the old street trolley system that went around the lake. And it really hugged the edge of the lake as it went around it. And what Olmsted proposed is that if we lower the lake by about 6 feet, you will now have a green space between the trolley track and the lake itself. That's why we have that trail around the lake with a little bit of green space around it. Why we have what used to be a big body of water, where we are right here, now is this field because of lowering the lake down. And we can see another aspect of it by looking at this image. So here's our 1894 image again. Here is Green Lake. Green Lake historically flowed out roughly down Ravenna Boulevard, through, down, and into the area there was a big bog here. And I'll show you a photo in a second. It flowed into this area. Here's Union Bay. So when the lake was dropped by 9 feet, you had a significant change. So first, this red line going through here, this red line is the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad. This was a railroad that was promoted by Thomas Burke and Daniel Gilman to access the east side of the mountains. Their goal was to get over the mountains to connect it to the east side of the state and also to reach some coal fields on the east side. So this is the railroad as it winds around. So this is the historic view, and here is the modern landscape shown on top of it. So here's the lake. Again, here we are. Here's the boundary of the lake as it was drawn, so slightly off. But the key thing down here is this is where University Village is. This area right here historically had been a big bog area. And if you ever wondered, it took me a while, why does the Burt Gilman Trail, as we all know this now, not the Seattle Lake Shore and Eastern, why does it make this big loop? Why doesn't it just cut across this landscape? It's because when it was built, it would have been cutting across a bay, a big body of water. So they lower the lake, that bog dries up, the bay that had come back into this area, roughly to about 45th Street where the viaduct is, that water gets lowered down, it becomes a big cattail swamp. And once that happens, they decide, you know, the best use of a cattail swamp is not as a cattail swamp, but as a dump. You may remember that that was where the city dump was, the Montlake Fill. Something like 90% of the city garbage ended up in that area. And if you've seen photos, there are these great photos, it's just covered in gulls. They probably don't show you all the rats. That area has gone through an amazing change. If you've been to the Center for Urban Horticulture, it's really in quite amazing shape. And it really, to me, exemplifies one of the stories of Seattle, and that is the story of looking at the landscape in a different lens, instead of as something to be used, but as something to be sustainable and care about. And we see that in the Center for Urban Horticulture. So I want to end by backing up to the story and thinking about it from the big picture. So this is Seattle in 1891. This is the downtown area. Here's Lake Union. We're way up here at Green Lake, just on the shore of Green Lake. And as I said, those early settlers who came to Seattle were an ambitious group of people. They wanted to create a great city. They basically were going as far west as they could. There's really not much further west of here. And they were going to do whatever was necessary to create a great city. And if it meant, one of the things they did, as I said, this area right here was a tidal flat. The Duwamish River flowed into here, and at low water, at low tide, this would drain out and be an open, empty space. So they fill in this area and create new land. They also realized that, okay, we may have to regrade our hills if we're going to make a great city. So they got rid of Denny Hill up here. They did some other work down here. They also had a third project that they were going to do to create a great city, and that was to link the fresh water of Lake Washington through to Lake Union, through to Salmon Bay. Each of these projects was unprecedented in scale. Each of them was unusual. Each of them was audacious, and I think really exemplifies that story of Seattle. But they were not all of them were successful. They took many years. As I said, Denny Regrade took decades for it really to realize its goal. But I still think it became part of the story of Seattle. And I don't think you can tell the story of Seattle without thinking about how we address landscape. And there's been, though, a fundamental change. Those early people who came here, they came with the idea if they needed to change the landscape to create a great city, they were going to do it. Denny Regrade, the tide flats filling in, or creating the ship canal. But what's changed in the last, particularly about the last 30 years, is we understand that the landscape has a great potential to change us. And by that I mean we understand the geological conditions of the city. Why else did we remove this big ribbon along here, the Alaskan Way Viaduct? We removed it because we understand the great potential for that to fall in an earthquake. We have 3 major earthquake zones in Seattle, one that goes about every 40 years, one that goes about every 400 years, one that goes about every 1,000 years. The 400 and 1,000 one, we're getting close to that. So we understand that the geology will change us, and we have to adapt to it. We also understand something that they could never possibly imagine, and that's climate change and sea level rise. The other big project over the last few years in Seattle, sort of big public project, was the replacement of the seawall along the waterfront. Not only is it a seismic issue, it's also a habitat issue because the new seawall is designed for better habitat for salmon, but it's also a sea level rise issue. And it's built to be better adapted to the rise in sea level. So for me, I don't think you can really tell the story of Seattle without telling it through its history of place, through its history of landscape. And I think we're going to continue to think about that relationship. We're going to continue to think about how do we change the landscape, adapt it to fit our needs. But that landscape, it's a two-way street. It's always going to affect us. We're always going to have to think about how is the landscape going to influence us? How is it going to change us over time? And that to me is really one of the central stories of Seattle. How do we change the landscape? And how does landscape change us? Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions.
And I have the microphone. Oop. Okay, any questions?
What was the population of the city when they did the Regrade renovation?
Yeah, that's a good question. What was the population of the city? During the fourth Regrade, the really big one, it was about 200,000 people.
That many?
Yeah, so it was, the city made some big changes. It was, we think of there's lots of population change in recently, but percentage-wise, they were much greater early on in our story. But there's about 200,000 people when it was during the major Regrade of the 1908 to 1910.
I had one other question.
Please, yeah.
When they did the, I'm a little mixed up on my timing, but they had to raise, you do the underground tours.
Oh, right.
And I can't remember how that, because it was a long time ago. At what point did they do that? Was that after the fire?
Yes, that's a great question. So we have the underground tours, and the reason the underground exists is exactly as you said. It's the fire, June 6th, 1889, Seattle burns to the ground. And when they decide to rebuild the city, one of the things that they decide to do is the area down around Pioneer Square, they decide to raise up the streets about 8 to 10 feet because there was a problem, because they're built right at sea level, they had some sewage problems. So what they do is, again, the city is responsible for city curb to curb. So the homeowner or the building owners are responsible for their own property. They know that the street is going to be raised up to a new level. So what they do is they start building their property at the original grade, and knowing that what is their first floor is going to be their basement. Once the street comes up, it takes a couple of years for the street to get up to that level. So that's why that underground tour exists. But yeah, it's really interesting. We lower and raise. I mean, it's Seattle. We can never make up our minds. Yeah, question.
You mentioned that the Green Lake had drained down roughly under Ravenna Boulevard.
Yes.
A lot of that was underground though, wasn't it? Is that what led to that collapse?
Oh, it's a good question. Yeah, the collapse. So, if you're not familiar with this story, so Green Lake historically, the creek basically ran down Ravenna. But in 1908, 1909, they basically put Ravenna Creek and the sewer system into about a 6-foot wide pipe that runs down Ravenna, cuts through the hill, and goes through to the other side, in essence, down towards where University Village is. And I think it was in '57, there was that sewage pipe burst, and basically a big sinkhole developed, and that's because of the pipe system there. So that sinkhole developed, took it out about a block or so, and then they eventually filled it in. But there
was a surface creek there then before.
There was a surface creek before there, yes. So that was the original drainage.
The reason I asked was my dad was parked right on top of where it collapsed. He wasn't in the car, but his car was.
Wow.
It went into the hole.
You're famous. Or the car is famous.
I don't know if it's still there or not. But it's always fascinating. I still don't quite see how a surface creek would...
Oh, so that's a good question. What happens? So there's a slight change there. So the creek goes along, and it takes a left turn through Callan and Ravenna Parks. The sewage pipe just goes straight through the hill. So two different things. Where that collapse was, there was no creek historically. If I was a little unclear on that, yeah. So the creek took a left turn, jogging to the north.
It would be down under Ravenna and Callan Park.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, thank you, yeah, a great story.
It's-
I always like
I'll
people
tell
on
you
those.
more about it later.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, I'll make my the second announcement. If you are interested in any of the books, they're for sale in back. I take credit cards, cash, check. As people have heard, my mom says that they're really good books. She says they make wonderful presents for grandchildren, children, nephews, nieces, people you've never met, everybody. So again, it's been my honor and pleasure. Thank you for coming out today.